Say, kids, what time is it?
It's story time!
Alright, so welcome back again to another episode of Storytime with Old Dog. We're still working our way through the Chronicle of Stone, Jason of the Chrononauts, episode 1. So let's go ahead and let's go to our bookmark here. And let's continue. And I hope you all have been enjoying and reading along with me. Alright, so Hauser opened the door and walked into the small room that was nothing more than a hallway with a door on either side. He nodded slightly at the armed guard. Anything from our guest? The guard shook his head. Nothing, sir. Hauser frowned and continued through the door on the other side of the room. He stepped into a large open room with several smaller rooms behind, large plate glass windows along one side. Two of the smaller rooms were occupied by the gardeners that had become frozen by whoever had attacked the SUV. The third room was occupied by one of his agents, also frozen. Hauser saw who he was looking for standing in front of one of the large windows and approached him silently. Abraham Fior, the lead medical technician, looked up from the iPad he had been reviewing and nodded to Hauser. Hauser looked into the room at the gardener who stood stock still. Do we know what froze them? Abraham shook his head. Technically, they're not frozen. What do you mean? Nelson noticed that one of them looked different from when we first collected them this morning at the school. Hauser turned to him. Different? Different how? Abraham held up the iPad and tapped the play button on a video. This is a security recording of our friend here. Watch what happens when I play it at an accelerated speed. The high angle of the security camera showed the gardener moving in slow motion. Hauser looked at him with alarm. They are still moving? Yes, sir, and given enough time, they could simply walk out of here. Well, they could if they weren't locked up in the observation cells. Hauser watched the still form of the gardener. To the naked eye, he couldn't tell the old man was moving at all. What form of technology could do something like that? What could slow him down so that time was happening at a different rate for him than the rest of the world around him? Now, more than ever, it was important to have the kid decode the wall and the book. If someone had developed time devices and time weapons, they needed to be prepared. Especially if these weapons were going to be used against the interests of the United States. Abraham cleared his throat. There's something else. Hauser tore his eyes away from the gardener to look at the scientists. Abraham reviewed his iPad again. These guys are heavy. This one weighs in at nearly 320 pounds. Hauser nearly gave himself whiplash as his head turned quickly to look at the frail old Matt gardener. He doesn't look like he should weigh more than 105 pounds soaking wet. We are still running tests to determine the cause for the discrepancies in their actual versus perceived weight. Hauser studied the gardener. He couldn't decide whether he noticed the gardener moving or if it was his imagination. He watched a little longer. There! He was certain he had seen the gardener moving that time. He turned to say something to the scientist when the gardener suddenly vaulted forward and slammed against the plate glass, shattering it before exploding outward into the room. Pierce glanced at his watch. Jason should have already informed the men that he would not transfer the artifact yet and should have already asked to see his mother. Pierce watched the main gate to the complex as the moon slowly crawled across the dark sky. He looked at his watch again. Jason's mother had not been brought to the complex yet. By his calculations, she should have been here an hour ago. The Valkyries might have changed too much when they tried to take Jason at the school. For the first time, he thought about when he had frozen the Valkyries to stop their attack. What if they had been captured by the local authorities before they could jump? They could still be present in this timeline, actively altering history with their continued presence. Suddenly, alarm klaxons sounded all around the complex. Hauser fell backward as the glass exploded outward. The gardener landed on his feet and grabbed Abraham, lifting him a foot off the ground. He flung the scientist across the room effortlessly before turning toward Hauser. Hauser was on his feet and crouched slightly, surprised by the gardener's strength. The lights dimmed and red flashing strobes lit the room in a pattern of alternating light and darkness. At the same moment, alarms blared deafeningly. Hauser looked from the flashing lights back to the gardener, readying himself to fend off his attack. Hauser blinked rapidly and scanned the room around him again. The gardener was gone. A visual distortion in the air moved swiftly at him. His His brain spent too mumuch time trying to figure out what was causing the disturbance when it hit him across the face and he went down, smacking his head on the floor and passing out. Hauser stood in the darkened room, his hands resting lightly behind his back as he watched Jason through the one-way glass. Both gardeners had disappeared, and it had taken 2 hours to inspect every nook and cranny of the complex before it was determined that they had somehow escaped. Review of security footage showed the gardener becoming invisible before attacking Hauser. He shattered the glass in the other cell, and as soon as he was close to the other frozen gardener, they both disappeared completely. The entire organization that Hauser was in charge of was responsible for explaining the unexplainable, but the sudden disappearance of the two gardeners was still something he could not explain. The entire complex was still on high alert, but it was time to proceed with the mission and not delay any longer. Maybe the boy's book would shed some light on what had just happened. He addressed the other agent in the room without taking his eyes off of Jason. Has he said anything? He asked to use the restroom an hour ago. Other than that, nothing. Hauser looked at his watch. The act of moving his head quickly reminded him of the slight concussion he'd received when he was knocked unconscious. How much longer before the mother arrives? She should have been here 10 minutes ago. Oh, she should be here in 10 minutes. Why did it take so long? She had to wait for the babysitter to finish her homework before coming over to watch the younger sibling. And then when the alarm sounded, the complex was shut down. She was redirected to a safe house for nearly an hour while we waited for the all clear. Making her wait outside while they secured the complex after the escape of the gardeners was necessary, but it delayed a timed sense of operation. Hauser shook his head. He was used to dealing with adults, not children. He had ordered his team that went to collect the mother to be conscious of how they treated her. He needed Jason's complete cooperation, and with the introduction of a new threat, he needed it sooner than later. Any delay put them at risk of losing the edge that the kid's book could give them. He turned toward the door. I want to be informed immediately when she arrives. Yes, sir, the guard responded as Hauser left the room. On the other side of the one-way mirror, Jason sat at the metal table, resisting the urge to look at the mirror on the wall. He had been watched the entire time. Of that, he had no doubt. He had been placed in this room when the alarms had sounded. They had told him it was for his protection. He knew better. It was so they could keep an eye on him while they dealt with whatever emergency had come up. But the fact that he was being observed was not what unnerved him. It was a message written in stone 2,000 years ago and written specifically for him. He had read it twice, not believing what he had read the first time. That specific section of stone told him to ask to see his mother before telling Hauser anything. The text had identified Agent Hauser by name. The message then went on to say that he would not be given the chance to translate the journal Hauser had recovered. He would be leaving before then, but would be experiencing everything firsthand anyway. The sender of the message promised that his father was not only alive, but that he would find him when the time was right. At first, his brain had placed a "the" before the word time, but on his second reading, he noted that it didn't say when the time was right, but instead, when time was right, as if trying to convey that something was wrong with time itself. Even more unbelievable was who had written the message. He had read that part several times. Each time, it still said exactly the same thing. It was signed Jason Ryder. He had sent himself a message from the past that included a future he had yet to experience. Pierce held his scope to his eye and zoomed in on the security guard at the front gate. He pressed a button on the side of the scope and his bodysuit started to shimmer. The suit altered its appearance until it looked like he was wearing the same uniform as the guard. He looked at the ground and adjusted the scope, zooming through the dirt, rock, and cement of the underground complex that dwarfed the group of buildings built above the ground. The military complex that the men had taken Jason into stretched for miles, well beyond the boundary of the fence that circled the complex above the ground. The tiny arrow on the heads-up display showed him in the direction, in 3 dimensions, where Jason was located. By following the tracker's signal, he quickly found him in the small room, seated at a small table. The sound of gravel crunching under tires drew Pierce's attention to the front gate as the all-electric SUV rolled quietly to a stop and the driver flashed his credentials to the gate guard. The guard opened the gate and the SUV accelerated silently into the complex. Pierce used his scope to look through the dark-tinted windows at the single passenger in the back and smiled to himself. Jason's mother was finally on her way. Pierce put away the scope and double-checked the energy levels on the blaster. He would give Jason a few moments to talk with his mother, and then the mission would have to continue. He waited until the gate fully closed and for the guard to retake his post. Once the guard was in place, he sighted on the plasma blaster and pulled the trigger. A ball of bright blue plasma shot from the end of the blaster and engulfed the guard, slowing him down to a near stop. To the naked eye and the security cameras watching, it would look like the guard was doing his job, standing at attention in front of the gate. Only Pierce knew the guard was frozen in place, or at least moving so slowly as to appear frozen. Jason wiped at the sweat forming along his brow. He stood up and slipped off his jacket, draping it over the back of the chair. Just as he was sitting down again, the door opened. A huge smile broke across his face when his mother walked into the room and the door closed after her. Her face lit up, seeing him. "Jason!" They ran to each other and hugged tightly. She held him at arm's length after a hug. "What's going on? Nobody will tell me anything. Are you in some kind of trouble?" "I don't think so." "Then why did they bring you here?" "They want me to translate something for them." "Translate something? You aren't even scheduled to take Spanish classes until next year." "It has to do with the language Dad taught me." Her face fell. "Did they find some old notebook of his?" "Not exactly." "Well then, what is it they want you to translate?" A voice broke into the conversation before Jason could answer. "I'm afraid that information is classified, Mrs. Ryder." They both turned to see Agent Hauser standing in the doorway. They had been so engrossed in their conversation, neither had noticed the door open. He smiled at them. "Your son is helping us with some sensitive information that pertains to national security." She looked at Jason, her forehead crinkling in confusion. "National security?" She looked back at Hauser. "If this has to do with his father's research..." Hauser continued to smile, trying to keep her at ease as he cut her off. "I'm afraid I can't say what it's about, Mrs. Ryder, but I assure you we will take very good care of your son." She looked at Jason. He shrugged his shoulders in agreement as to say that he hadn't been mistreated in any way. She looked back at Hauser. "You can't keep him here against his will." Hauser folded his hands in front of him and adopted a non-aggressive posture. "We are only keeping him here to protect him." That set her off. "Protect him? Protect him from what?" Hauser's smile faded slightly. "I'm afraid that is also..." She cut him off. "Classified, right. Is everything classified where my son is concerned?" Hauser remained silent, but his eyes said that he had no intention of releasing Jason any time soon. She closed her eyes and let out a long breath before opening them again. Any time Jason had seen her do that, he knew he was about to get in a lot of trouble. This time, thankfully, it was directed to the government agent and not him. "Is there anything you can tell me about why you were keeping my son here?" "Very little," was all Hauser had time to say before a shout emanated from the hallway. He spun around as the door opened, and a guard appeared, pointing his rifle at him. "What is the meaning?" Hauser didn't have a chance to finish his question when the guard fired the rifle. Hauser was immediately engulfed in a bright blue ball of electricity. When the electricity faded away, the guard stepped around the still form of Hauser and into the room, holding his rifle at the ready. As soon as he saw Jason, he took another step forward, lowering the rifle. "Are you Jason?" Jason nodded. This must be the man the Stonewall told him about. The man indicated his mother with a jerk of his head. "Who's this?" "It's my mom." The man checked a black band around his wrist and then looked back at them while shaking his head. "We don't have much time. Come with me." He held up his hand, stopping Jason's mom, who stepped forward as well. "Only Jason." Jason looked at his mom and then back at the man with the rifle. "You can't leave my mom here." The man pointed his rifle at Jason's mom and fired. She let out a cry that was cut off when the electric cloud encompassed her and she stopped moving altogether. Jason gawked at his mother. "What did you do to her?" The man reached forward, yanking Jason's arm. "She'll be fine. We have to go. Now." Jason nodded and let the man drag him out into the hallway. The man let go of him and raised his rifle, firing right before another guard came around the corner. The guard froze in place. The man looked back at Jason and gave him a hard stare. "Stay close." Jason nodded and followed the man as he made his way down the hall. All right. It's getting exciting now. So we'll put our bookmark in there. And once again, thank you very much for watching. If you're enjoying this series, subscribe. Keep watching it. Tell others about it. And let's spread the word and everything. And by all means, help me out as the author of these books here. And pick up your own copy of Jason the Chrononauts, The Chronicle of Stone. All right. Thank you very much. Have a great night.